The day after we buried my grandmother, her son, my Uncle Robert, showed up with his wife Diane and a U-Haul. He had a key to the house I no longer recognized, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and a piece of paper he claimed was the final word on everything. I was 18 years and 3 days old. For those 3 days, I had been an adult orphan, rattling around in the quiet farmhouse that had been my entire world. Now the silence was broken by the scrape of boxes on wooden floors and the murmur of their voices, deciding which of my grandmother's things were trash and which were treasure. What they found would go to them. What they decided I could have would change my life forever, but not in the way they planned. If you've ever been made to feel small in a place you once called home, if you've ever had to fight for a memory, then this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button, because we're a community of people who know what it's like to have to build a new foundation from the ground up. I was sitting on the front porch steps, the same ones I'd learned to walk on, watching them work. The air was thick with the late autumn chill of the Pacific Northwest, a damp cold that seeped into your bones. It smelled of wet earth and pine, a scent that had always meant comfort but now felt like a final goodbye. Robert walked out, wiping his hands on his jeans. He avoided looking at me directly, his eyes fixed on some distant point over the rolling hills. "Look, Alara," he began, the name feeling foreign in his mouth. My grandmother, June, had always called me Elle. We're not trying to be cruel, but the will is clear. The house, the land, it's mine. Your grandmother wanted you taken care of course. There's a small trust. It'll be released to you, but you can't stay here. I didn't say anything. What was there to say? I had spent the last 2 years nursing her through the illness that had slowly stolen her from us. From me. I had changed her sheets, cooked her meals, read to her when her eyes grew too tired. Robert and Diane had visited twice. Once for a strained Christmas dinner where they talked about property values, and once near the end, a brief, sterile visit to the hospice room that lasted less than an hour. They saw a burden. I saw the woman who had taken me in when I was 4 years old, a scared little girl with nothing but a worn teddy bear and a history I was too young to understand. She had given me a home. Her son was now taking it away. Diane came out, carrying a cardboard box. It wasn't sealed. Inside, I could see my childhood drawings, a few worn paperbacks, the chipped mug I'd made for June in a pottery class. My life, condensed into a single, flimsy container. "We packed a few of your personals," she said, her voice brittle with false sympathy. She placed the box on the step below me, a careful distance away, as if grief were contagious. "The lawyer, Mr. Davies, will be in touch about the rest, the financial stuff." The financial stuff was a ghost, a promise. I had $512 in my own bank account, saved from odd jobs I'd done for neighbors. It wasn't enough for a first and last month's rent on a shoebox apartment in town. It wasn't enough for anything. I just nodded, my throat too tight to form words. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a movie about someone else's life. The protagonist was about to be written out of her own story. Robert cleared his throat again. "There is one other thing," he said, almost an afterthought. He pulled a single, old-fashioned key from his pocket. It was heavy, made of dark, slightly rusted metal. Not a house key. "The Quonset, out back. For some reason, your grandmother put that in your name separately a few years ago. Deeds filed with the county and everything. It's yours." He tossed the key. It landed with a soft thud on the porch beside me. "Frankly, it's a liability, full of junk. You'll probably have to pay to have it all hauled away, but legally, it's your problem now." He turned and went back inside, the screen door slamming shut behind him. His problem now. The words echoed in the sudden quiet. The Quonset hut. It was a long, corrugated steel half-cylinder that sat at the far edge of the property, half hidden by overgrown blackberry bushes. We'd called it the Tin Turtle when I was a kid. It was where my grandfather, who died long before I was born, had kept his tools and tinkered with old engines. For as long as I could remember, it had been locked. June had always waved a hand dismissively when I'd asked about it. "Just old ghosts in there, Elle. Nothing for you." I looked from the key, dull against the weathered gray wood of the porch, to the hulking shape of the hut in the distance. It was ugly, an industrial scar on the otherwise beautiful landscape, a liability. Full of junk. To them, it was a final piece of administrative debris to be swept aside. An afterthought. They had taken the house, the land, the memories. They had left me a locked metal box on a forgotten corner of the property. They had no idea what they had just done. They thought they were leaving me with nothing. But my grandmother never did anything without a reason. And as the U-Haul rumbled to life, its diesel engine coughing smoke into the clean country air, I picked up the key. It was cold and heavy in my palm. It felt like the opposite of an ending. It felt like a beginning. The first night was the hardest. I used most of my $500 on a week at the Crossroads Motel, a sad little place on the edge of town where the neon sign flickered between vacancy and no vacancy, as if it couldn't make up its mind. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and pine-scented cleaner, a chemical combination that burned the back of my throat. I lay on the stiff polyester bedspread and stared at the water-stained ceiling, the box of my personals sitting unopened by the door. The key to the Quonset was on the nightstand, a dark, solid shape in the dim light. I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Not yet. It felt too heavy with a meaning I didn't understand, and my shoulders already ached with the weight of everything else. Grief is a funny thing. It's not just sadness, it's a physical state. My limbs felt weighted down, my thoughts moved through thick mud. Every small action, getting out of bed, brushing my teeth, finding something to eat, required a monumental effort of will. For 2 days, I barely left the room. I lived on vending machine crackers and tap water, watching the hours crawl by on the cheap digital clock. The world outside the grimy window felt loud and impossibly fast. Cars sped past on the highway. People laughed in the parking lot. It all seemed to belong to a different planet. My planet had shrunk to the size of this room, and its only inhabitants were me and the ghost of my grandmother. On the 3rd day, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but some instinct pushed my thumb against the screen. "Hello?" My voice was a croak. "Is this Ilara Vance?" a man's voice asked. It was calm and steady, a low baritone that commanded attention without being aggressive. "Yes, who is this?" "This is Arthur Davies. I was your grandmother's attorney, and her friend." Mr. Davies, the lawyer Robert had mentioned. I sat up, my heart giving a nervous flutter. "Oh, hello? I'm sorry for your loss, Ilara. June was a remarkable woman. I'm also sorry for the haste with which your uncle has acted. It was not, I think, what she would have wanted." There was a pause, a small space of shared acknowledgement. It was the first time anyone had said it out loud. And the validation was like a sip of cool water after days of thirst. "He had the will," I said, the words coming out flat. "He had a will," Mr. Davies corrected gently. "The one that pertained to the house and the main parcel of land. That part is, unfortunately, ironclad. She signed it 3 years ago. But it's not the whole story." I waited, my knuckles white where I gripped the phone. "As I'm sure Robert told you, the deed for the Quonset hut and the half-acre it sits on was transferred solely into your name on your 16th birthday. It is entirely, legally, yours, uncontested." "He said it was a liability," I mumbled, repeating my uncle's dismissive words. "He would think that," Mr. Davies said, and for the first time, I heard a hint of something other than professional calm in his voice. It sounded like dry amusement. Robert has never seen value in anything he couldn't immediately sell or brag about. Did he give you the key? Yes. I looked at it, sitting on the nightstand. My problem now. Good. Now, there's the matter of the trust she left you. It's not large, as Robert likely implied. It's $5,000. $5,000. It felt like a fortune and nothing at all at once. Enough to survive for a few months, but not enough to build a life. Okay, I said. But there's a condition attached to it, he continued. A strange one, I'll admit. June was very specific. The trust can only be accessed and released to you once you have spent one full night from sunset to sunrise inside the Quonset hut. I was silent. The stale air of the motel room seemed to thicken. A night? Inside that derelict metal shed? Why? I finally managed to ask. She didn't say. Her instructions were written, sealed, and very clear. She wanted you to have the key, and she wanted you to spend a night there. After you've done so, you are to call me, and I will begin the process of transferring the funds. She said, and I quote, Ilara will know what to do after that. He said Ilara will know what to do. Not I hope she knows, or I think she'll know. She said I will know. The certainty in her words, filtered through her lawyer, was a spark in the overwhelming darkness. My grandmother had been a planner. She was a woman who saved string, reused tea bags, and planted her garden based on a 20-year cycle of weather patterns she'd tracked in a tattered notebook. She did not do things by accident. This wasn't a strange, sentimental request. It was a message. It was the first step in a set of instructions I couldn't yet read. Ilara, are you still there? Yes, I said, my voice clearer now. Yes, I'm here. I have an office in town. My address is on the letterhead of the documents I'll be sending you. Feel free to stop by if you need anything. Anything at all. Thank you, Mr. Davies. Call me Arthur, he said. And call me after your night in the hut. We hung up. I stood and walked to the window, pulling back the thin, faded curtain. The world outside didn't look so alien anymore. The speeding cars were just people going somewhere. The sky, a uniform gray, held the promise of rain. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling slightly, but not from fear. It was something else. Anticipation. For the first time in days, I had a purpose. It was a strange and daunting one, but it was mine. I had to go back to the farm. Not to the house that was no longer mine, but to the rusty metal shell my uncle had so carelessly tossed aside. I had to spend a night with the old ghosts. My grandmother had left me a key, a test, and a promise. I would not let her down. The bus ride back out to the county line felt like traveling backward in time. Each familiar landmark, the old water tower, Miller's Feed and Seed, the sharp bend in the road where a massive oak tree stood like a lonely sentinel, was a pang of fresh grief. This was the route I'd taken to school for years. This was the landscape of my entire life. But today, I was a tourist in my own past. I got off at the stop a half-mile from the farm's main gate, a small bag slung over my shoulder. It contained a flashlight, a bottle of water, a blanket from the motel, and a bag of the same vending machine crackers that had been my sustenance. It wasn't much, but it felt like preparing for an expedition. Walking up the long gravel driveway was the hardest part. I kept my eyes down, focused on the crunch of my boots on the stones. I didn't want to look at the house. I could feel it there, just to my left, a silent, looming presence. I could imagine the windows, dark and empty, like vacant eyes. I could imagine Robert and Diane's car parked out front. It felt like trespassing on my own memories. I forced myself to walk faster, my gaze fixed on the rounded top of the Quonset hut, barely visible over the rise. The air grew cooler as I approached it. The blackberry brambles were thicker than I remembered, their thorny canes reaching out like grasping fingers. I had to push my way through them, the thorns snagging on my jacket. It was as if the land itself was trying to protect this place, to keep it hidden. Finally, I stood before it. The hut was bigger up close, a hulking monument of corrugated steel, streaked with long, rust-colored tiers. The double doors were massive, secured by a heavy-duty padlock that looked almost as old as the structure itself. This was what the key was for. My hand trembled as I inserted the key into the lock. It was a stubborn fit. I had to jiggle it, pushing with all my might until it finally slid home with a grating click. The lock was heavy. Turning it took both hands, and the mechanism protested with a loud, groaning screech that echoed in the quiet afternoon. The shackle sprang open. I pulled the lock free, its weight surprising me, and slid the thick metal bolt across. One of the huge doors creaked inward a few inches. A wave of air washed over me, and with it, a smell I couldn't quite place. It was a dense, layered scent of old oil, cold metal, damp earth, and something else. Something dry and papery, like a forgotten library. It was the smell of time itself. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and pushed the door open wider. A sliver of gray afternoon light cut through the gloom, illuminating a universe of dust motes dancing in the air. I stepped inside. The door swung shut behind me with a deep, resonant boom, plunging me into near-total darkness. The sudden absence of light was absolute, disorienting. For a moment, I panicked, my heart hammering against my ribs. I fumbled in my bag for the flashlight, my fingers clumsy and cold. I found the switch, and a powerful beam of white light sliced through the blackness. My first impression was of chaos. The space was enormous, far larger than it had appeared from the outside, with a high, curved ceiling that was lost in shadow. And it was packed. Piled everywhere were the ghosts of my grandfather's life and the life of the farm before I was even born. There were stacks of old tires, rusted engine blocks, wooden crates with faded stenciling, shelves filled with glass jars containing murky liquids, and collections of nuts and bolts. A thick blanket of dust and cobwebs covered everything, softening the hard edges, turning the entire space into a single, monolithic sculpture of forgotten things. My uncle was right about one thing. It was full of junk. I swept the beam of the flashlight around the cavernous interior. Against the far wall, there was an old workbench, littered with tools. Above it, more shelves, sagging under the weight of paint cans and coffee tins full of screws. A disassembled tractor lay in pieces like the skeleton of some prehistoric beast. It was overwhelming, a testament to decades of accumulation. Where was I supposed to sleep in all this? How could a single night here lead to any kind of answer? I felt a surge of doubt, cold and sharp. Maybe Robert was right. Maybe this was just a final, eccentric act from a woman whose mind was failing. A cruel joke. I was standing in a cold, dirty shed, surrounded by trash, on a fool's errand. The $5,000 felt very far away. I almost turned to leave. I could walk back to the road, catch the evening bus back to the motel, and try to figure out a new plan. A real plan. But then, my grandmother's voice echoed in my head, as clear as if she were standing beside me. "Just old ghosts in there, Elle. Nothing for you." She had said it with a smile, a twinkle in her eye I hadn't understood at the time. It wasn't a warning. It was a misdirection. She had been protecting this place. For me. My resolve hardened. I was here for a reason. I swept the light across the room again, more slowly this time, looking for something that didn't fit. Something that wasn't a tool, or an engine part, or a dusty relic of the farm. My eyes scanned past a stack of old fence posts, a pile of burlap sacks, a rack of ancient, bald tires. And then I saw it. In the back corner, partially hidden behind a large, draped canvas tarp, was something different. It wasn't metal or wood. It was a piece of furniture. A beautiful, old, roll-top desk made of dark cherry wood. It was completely out of place, an object of warmth and domesticity in this cold, industrial tomb. It was dusty, yes, but it seemed to have been protected from the worst of the grime by the tarp. And sitting squarely in the center of the desk, untouched by the surrounding chaos, was a single, large, manila envelope. It was clean. Too clean. It looked as if it had been placed there yesterday. My name was written on it in my grandmother's elegant, familiar script. Ilara. My breath caught in my throat. This was it. This was the starting point. I walked toward the desk, my boots crunching on the concrete floor. The air around it seemed different, stiller. I reached out and touched the smooth, cool wood of the desk, then gently picked up the envelope. It was thick, heavy. I could feel the stiff edges of papers inside. I pulled the blanket from my bag, shook it out, and draped it over a nearby wooden crate, creating a makeshift seat. I sat down, the flashlight propped up to illuminate the desk. The rest of the hut disappeared into the darkness, leaving me in a small bubble of light with the desk and the envelope. My heart was pounding, a steady, rhythmic drumbeat in the profound silence. I turned the envelope over. It wasn't sealed with glue. The metal clasp was simply folded down. It was an invitation. Carefully, I lifted the clasp and pulled out a thick stack of folded papers. On top was a letter, several pages long, all covered in her handwriting. I took another shaky breath and began to read. "My dearest L," the letter began, and I had to stop, my eyes blurring with sudden, hot tears. I could hear her voice in the words, the specific cadence, the warmth. I wiped my eyes on the sleeve of my jacket and forced myself to continue. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone. And it means you have been brave enough to come to this cold, dusty old place. I am so proud of you. I know you must be frightened and confused, and for that, I am sorrier than I can ever say. There is so much I have to explain, and I'm afraid a letter is a poor substitute for a real conversation, but it's the only one we have left. Please, read this to the end, and trust me." I looked up from the page, into the oppressive darkness of the hut. The only sound was the frantic beating of my own heart. Trust her. Of course I trusted her. I had trusted her with my life. I looked back down at the letter. First, the house. I know Robert has taken it. I know it must feel like the ultimate betrayal, from him and from me. You must believe me when I say that giving him the house was one of the hardest things I have ever had to do, but it was necessary. It was the only way to protect you and to protect this. The word "this" was underlined twice. This. The Quonset hut. This desk. This letter. Your uncle, as you know, has always had a complicated relationship with money, and with his father. Your grandfather was a brilliant mechanic, a tinkerer, a man who could build anything from scratch. But he was not a good businessman. He took out loans, made bad investments. When he died, he left me with a mountain of debt, most of it tied to this farm. I spent 20 years paying it off, bit by bit. But there was one debt, a private one to a very dangerous man that I could never seem to clear. Your uncle found out about it. He has always resented this land, saw it as the thing that kept his father poor, that kept him from the inheritance he felt he was owed. He threatened to use that old debt, to expose it to the lender's family, who are not kind people. He said they would take the whole farm, and that you and I would be left with nothing, or worse. He gave me a choice: sign the main house and the profitable acreage over to him in the will, and he would handle the old debt himself, making it disappear, or he would let the wolves have us. I had to stop reading. A cold fury, unlike anything I had ever felt, washed over me. Blackmail. He had blackmailed his own mother. He had threatened his elderly, ailing mother and his teenage niece to get what he wanted. The image of him on the porch, his face a mask of false concern, flashed in my mind. We're not trying to be cruel. The lie was so profound it made me feel sick. I forced myself to read on, my hands shaking. I know what you are thinking, Elle. Why didn't I fight him? Why didn't I call his bluff? Because I was tired, and I was sick. And my priority was not winning a fight with my bitter son. My priority was you, securing a future for you. So I made a deal with the devil. I gave him what he thought was the prize. The house, the fields. I let him think he had won. But your grandfather was smarter than Robert ever gave him credit for. And so am I. The real value of this place was never the house. It was never the land you can see. It was always what was hidden. This Quonset hut, and the small parcel of land it's on, was deeded to me separately by your grandfather before he died, free and clear of any of his debts. It was his sanctuary, his real workshop. He called it the nest egg. When you were born, I knew this place would one day be yours. I had it legally separated and put in your name the moment I could. Robert never knew. He never cared enough to look at the county records, to ask the right questions. He just saw a rusty shed full of junk. He saw what he wanted to see. I looked around the dark, cavernous space. Not junk, a sanctuary, a nest egg. So now we come to the reason I made you spend a night here. It wasn't a whim, my love. It was to give you time. Time to be away from prying eyes. Time to find this desk. And time to decide. In this desk, you will find everything you need. You will find the truth. And you will find a choice. There are 3 drawers. The one on the left contains the past. The one on the right contains a possible future. And the center drawer contains the present. I want you to open the left drawer first. But before you do, please know this. Whatever you find, whatever you choose to do, you are strong enough to handle it. You have a resilience in you that you don't even recognize yet. You have my heart, and you have your grandfather's hands. You can build anything. Now be brave. The letter ended there. Her signature, a little shakier than I remembered, was at the bottom. I folded the pages carefully and placed them on the desk. The silence of the hut pressed in on me again, but it was different now. It wasn't empty. It was filled with purpose, with a story that was finally being told. The past, a future, and the present. It was a map. My grandmother had left me a map. My gaze fell on the 3 drawers of the old cherry desk. The one on the left, the past. My hand hovered over the small brass handle, my reflection a distorted ghost in its polished surface. The flashlight beam was steady. The world had shrunk to this desk, this choice. I took a breath, curled my fingers around the handle, and pulled. The drawer slid open with a smooth, quiet whisper of well-made wood. It wasn't a choice anymore. It was a necessity. The motel room, with its flickering sign and chemical smell, felt like a lifetime ago. Here, in the cold, dusty air of the Quonset, I felt more at home than I had since June died. The space was no longer just a collection of my grandfather's forgotten projects. It was a vault, a time capsule, and my grandmother had just given me the key. I sat there for a long moment, the open letter resting on the desk, its words settling into my bones. The fury at my uncle was a hot coal in my chest, but it was banked by a deeper, more profound emotion, a wave of overwhelming love for the woman who had orchestrated all of this. She hadn't abandoned me. She had armed me. I felt a sudden, intense need to talk to someone, to share the weight of this revelation. It's a strange moment, isn't it? When a truth you've been handed is so heavy you can't carry it alone, even for a second. If you've made it this far in the story, maybe you know that feeling. It's the moment you realize a secret isn't just information, it's a burden, and you need a witness. For those of you who have carried those kinds of secrets, who have had your world turned upside down by a letter or a late-night phone call, I see you. This community is for you. If this is hitting home, drop a comment down below and just type, "I get it." You don't have to share the details, but just know you're not alone in carrying that weight. Your story matters here. Now let's get back to that drawer, the left one, the past. I leaned forward, shining the flashlight beam into the open drawer. It was filled with neatly organized files and envelopes, each one labeled in June's handwriting. The top folder was thick, bound with a rubber band. The label simply said, "Robert." My hand hesitated. This felt like a violation, like reading someone's diary. But June had told me to. She had wanted me to understand. I slipped the rubber band off and opened the folder. Inside were not letters, but documents. Photocopies of cashed checks written from my grandmother's account to various online gambling sites. Credit card statements with Robert's name on them showing thousands of dollars in debt. A printed-out email exchange between him and a payday loan company, the tone growing more desperate with each message. And at the bottom, a formal, notarized letter of agreement. It was the deal she had described. It stated that in exchange for Robert B. Vance assuming and clearing a private debt owed by the estate of his late father, June Vance agreed to amend her will to leave the primary residence and its surrounding 40 acres to him. It was dated 3 years ago. It was all there, in black and white. The proof of his greed, his desperation, and his coercion. She had kept the receipts. My practical, frugal grandmother had documented her own son's betrayal with the same methodical precision she used to label her jars of canned peaches. It was devastating and, in a strange way, incredibly validating. I wasn't crazy. My feelings of anger and injustice were real. He wasn't just a callous son. He was a predator who had preyed on his own mother's vulnerability. Beneath that folder was another, smaller one, labeled, "Your father." My breath hitched. My father, June's other son, had died in a car accident when I was 3. My mother had disappeared from my life shortly after, unable to cope. That was the story I'd always been told. It was a simple, tragic, and blessedly short story that required no further questions. Inside this folder, there was no mountain of documents. There was only a single, thin envelope. I slid out a photograph. It was of a young man with kind eyes and the same shy smile I sometimes saw in my own reflection. My father. He had his arm around a woman, my mother. She was beautiful, but her eyes held a deep, haunted sadness. Tucked behind the photo was a letter. Not from June, but from my father, addressed to her. The handwriting was messy, rushed. It was a short, frantic note. "Mom," it read, "I have to get her out. She's using again, and it's bad this time. I can't let her be around Ilara. I'm taking Elle to your place. I'll be back for her as soon as I can get Sarah into a facility. I love you. Don't let her know where we are." It wasn't a car accident. Or at least, not just a car accident. He had been fleeing. He had been trying to save me. I sat there, the photo and the letter in my hand, as a 15-year-old memory gap in my life was suddenly, brutally filled in. My mother hadn't just left. She had been a danger. My father hadn't just died. He had died while trying to protect me. And my grandmother had taken on that protection, honoring his last wish. She had kept me safe, not just from my mother, but from the truth itself, until she thought I was old enough to bear it. I cried then, Not the quiet, hot tears from before, but deep, ragged sobs that shook my whole body. I cried for the father I never knew, a hero in a story I'd never been told. I cried for the mother whose addiction had cost us everything. I cried for my grandmother, who had carried the weight of all these secrets, all these sorrows, for so long, all by herself. And I cried for the little girl who had spent her life believing she was abandoned, when in fact she had been fiercely, desperately loved and protected from the very start. I don't know how long I sat there, hunched over in the cold, my grief echoing in the vast, silent space. The flashlight beam wavered as my hand shook. The past wasn't just a collection of facts in a drawer. It was a living, breathing thing, and it had just rewritten my entire identity. The weight of it was immense. I felt small and powerless, a teenager in a dusty shed, holding the broken pieces of a family she barely understood. The $5,000, the condition of staying the night, it all seemed so trivial now. This was so much bigger than that. I folded my father's letter, tucked it back into the envelope with the photograph, and gently placed the folder back in the drawer. I didn't have the strength to look at anything else. I pushed the drawer shut. The quiet click sounded like a closing casket. I was exhausted. The emotional onslaught had left me feeling hollowed out, scoured clean. I pulled the thin motel blanket tighter around my shoulders, the flimsy fabric offering little comfort against the deep, penetrating cold of the hut. Sunset was still a few hours away, but inside this metal tomb, time had no meaning. It was perpetually twilight. My mission, according to Mr. Davies, was to spend the night. I had to see it through. But the thought of what might be in the other two drawers, a possible future, the present, was too much to handle. Not now. I needed to just be. To absorb the shock. I slid off the crate and decided to explore, to move my body, to reconnect with the physical world. I aimed the flashlight away from the desk and began a slow circuit of the hut's perimeter. I ran my hand along the cold, corrugated steel walls. I looked more closely at the things my grandfather had left behind. There was a kind of order to the chaos, I realized. The engine parts were grouped by make and model. The tools on the workbench were arranged by size. The jars on the shelves were labeled in his neat, blocky handwriting. Hex nuts 1/4 inch, copper fittings, carburetor screws. This wasn't a junk pile. It was a library of parts, a place of immense potential. Near the back wall, I found something I hadn't noticed before. It was a small, wood-burning stove, its stovepipe snaking up and out through a neatly sealed hole in the curved ceiling. Next to it was a tidy stack of firewood and a box of matches. My grandmother's work. She had prepared this place for me, not just with the desk and the letters, but with the practical necessities: warmth, light. I knelt down, opened the stove's small iron door, and began to build a fire. The simple, methodical task was a relief. I crumpled some old newspaper I found in a crate, laid the kindling in a small teepee, and struck a match. The flame caught, and a small, hungry fire began to lick at the dry wood. Soon, a steady, comforting warmth began to push back against the damp chill. As the fire grew, casting flickering orange light around the hut, I felt a measure of peace settle over me. The shadows danced, making the piles of metal and wood seem less menacing, more mysterious. I was in a cocoon, a strange, metallic womb, protected from the world outside. I thought about the house, just a few hundred yards away. Robert and Diane were in there, sleeping in my grandmother's bed, walking on her floors, believing they had won. They were celebrating their inheritance, an empty victory built on a lie. They had the house, but I had the truth. I had the history. I had the heart of the entire operation. A sudden noise from outside startled me. The sound of an engine, much closer than the highway. Headlights swept across the front of the hut, casting long, distorted shadows through the small gaps in the doors. My heart leaped into my throat. Who was here? The engine cut out, followed by the slam of a car door. Heavy footsteps crunched on the gravel outside. "Elara?" a voice called out. It was Robert. "I know you're in there. The neighbors saw your flashlight. What the hell are you doing?" I froze, my back pressed against the cold steel wall. I didn't answer. The fire crackled in the stove, the only sound inside the hut. "This is private property," he yelled, his voice tight with anger. "You're trespassing. I don't care if June left you this heap of junk. The driveway is mine. You get out of there, right now." The handle on the big metal door rattled. He was trying to open it, but the bolt was shot from the inside. He couldn't get in. A wave of relief washed over me, quickly replaced by a surge of defiance. This was my space. He had no power here. "Go away, Robert," I called out, my voice steadier than I expected. There was a moment of shocked silence. Then, a low, furious growl. "You have 5 minutes to get your things and leave, or I'm calling the sheriff and having you removed." The sheriff. The threat hung in the air. Could he do that? I was on my own property, but he was right about the driveway. The legalities were a tangled mess I didn't understand. Fear began to prick at the edges of my newfound courage. But then I looked at the desk, at the closed drawer containing the proof of his blackmail. I thought of my father's letter. I thought of my grandmother's final instruction. Be brave. I walked to the door, my steps sure and deliberate. I stood right behind it, my face inches from the cold metal. "This Quonset is legally mine, Robert," I said, my voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even me. "I have a right to be here, and I'm not leaving." "You little brat," he hissed through the door. "You have no idea what you're messing with." "No," I said, and the word was as solid and final as the steel door between us. "I'm just beginning to find out. Now leave, before you make things worse for yourself." There was another long silence. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, the confusion, the rage. He was used to being in control. He wasn't in control anymore. Finally, I heard him spit a curse into the dirt, followed by the crunch of his footsteps walking away. A car door slammed, the engine roared to life, and the headlights swept away, plunging the front of the hut back into darkness. He was gone. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, my body trembling with adrenaline. The confrontation had been terrifying, but exhilarating. I had stood my ground. I had protected my sanctuary. I walked back to the fire, its warmth a welcome comfort. The immediate threat had passed, but I knew this was just the beginning. He would be back. He wouldn't let this go. He had called it a heap of junk, but now that I had claimed it, now that I had defied him, his greed would make him suspicious. He would start wondering what was inside. I knew I couldn't wait. I had to know what was in the other drawers. I walked back to the desk, the flickering firelight making the cherry wood glow. I had faced the past. Now it was time to look at the future. My hand went to the drawer on the right. With a deep breath, I pulled it open. The right-hand drawer, the one June had labeled as a possible future, was not filled with documents. Instead, it held a single, large, flat object wrapped in oilcloth. It was heavy. I lifted it out and placed it on the desk, unwrapping it carefully. It was a laptop computer. Not new, but not ancient either. A sturdy-looking model a few years old. Taped to the lid was a small note in June's handwriting. "The password is your grandfather's name, all lowercase. He would have liked that you're using his workshop." My grandfather's name was Thomas. I had a sudden, vivid memory of June telling me stories about him, about how he believed technology and craftsmanship could solve any problem. I lifted the laptop's lid. The screen came to life, asking for the password. I typed THOMAS. The desktop appeared. It was clean, almost empty, with only 2 icons on it. One was a folder labeled The Nest Egg. The other was a shortcut to a web browser. Next to the laptop in the drawer was a small, sealed box and a power cord. The box contained a mobile hotspot device, the kind that creates its own Wi-Fi network. Another note was attached. Prepaid for 1 year. The world is out there, Elle. Don't be afraid to connect to it. A year of internet. My grandmother had thought of everything. She had given me not just a shelter, but a window to the world, a tool. My fingers trembled as I moved the cursor and double-clicked on the folder named The Nest Egg. It opened to reveal a meticulous digital archive. There were dozens of subfolders, each one neatly labeled. Property deeds, bank accounts, investment portfolio, building plans. My mind reeled. Investment portfolio? I clicked on it. A spreadsheet opened. It was a list of stocks and bonds, names I vaguely recognized from the news. Blue-chip tech companies, stable utility stocks, mutual funds. At the bottom of the column, there was a total. I stared at it, certain I was reading it wrong. I counted the zeros twice. It was a little over $300,000. I felt the air leave my lungs in a rush. I leaned back, my hand covering my mouth. $300,000. It was an impossible number. A fairy tale number. Where had it come from? I clicked frantically through the other folders. Under bank accounts, I found statements for an online savings account, also in my name, established as a trust that I would gain control of on my 18th birthday. It had been funded by small, regular deposits over the past 10 years. The current balance was just over $50,000. The story began to piece itself together. My grandfather, the brilliant mechanic who wasn't a good businessman, had apparently made one very, very good investment a long time ago. A single, smart stock purchase, maybe in some local tech startup that had since become a giant. He had tucked it away, a secret from his creditors and even, perhaps, from my grandmother for a time. This was the real nest egg, not the Quonset itself, but what it had been built to protect. June had cultivated it, managed it, and kept it hidden, a secret weapon for my future. She had lived frugally, letting her son believe she was barely scraping by, all while she was quietly building an empire for me. The sheer scale of her love, her foresight, was staggering. It was a love so fierce and strategic it took my breath away. She hadn't just endured Robert's cruelty, she had used it as a smokescreen. She let him take the house, the visible, tangible asset, to distract him from the invisible, far greater fortune she was safeguarding for me. He thought he'd won the kingdom, but he'd only managed to steal the front gate. I closed the laptop, my mind buzzing. This changed everything. I wasn't a destitute orphan anymore. I wasn't powerless. I had resources. I had options. I could walk away from this place, from Robert, from the whole painful history. I could take that money and disappear. Start a new life somewhere far away where no one knew my name. The thought was tempting, a sweet, seductive whisper of escape. No more fighting, no more drama, just freedom. But then I looked around the hut, at the warm glow of the firelight on the old tools, at the desk that held all my family's secrets. I thought of my grandfather, tinkering in this very spot. I thought of my grandmother, carefully packing these drawers, planning for this exact moment. This place wasn't just a shelter, it was a legacy. Walking away would mean letting Robert win in a different way. It would mean abandoning the last piece of them I had left. It would mean treating this inheritance, this sacred ground, the same way he had, as a pile of cash to be liquidated. My grandmother's words from the letter came back to me. You have my heart, and you have your grandfather's hands. You can build anything. She hadn't given me a suitcase full of cash and a plane ticket. She had given me a workshop. She had given me building plans, which I now saw was the name of another folder on the laptop. She had given me a choice not just between poverty and wealth, but between running and building. My path was suddenly, luminously clear. I wasn't going anywhere. This was my home now. This rusty, beautiful, ghost-filled Quonset hut. I would not let Robert, or the memory of his cruelty, chase me away from it. I would stay, I would fight, and I would build. The decision settled in my soul, a solid, grounding weight. The fear and uncertainty that had been my constant companions for days finally receded, replaced by a calm, cold resolve. This was my land. This was my future, and I was ready to claim it. There was still one drawer left, the center one, the one June had called the present. I had faced the past and seen a possible future. Now it was time to deal with the here and now. I turned back to the desk, my movements no longer hesitant. I was an active participant in this story now, not just a reader. I placed my hand on the final drawer and pulled. It slid open. Inside, there was no money, no documents, no laptop. There was only one object, sitting in the center of the drawer on a bed of faded velvet. It was a small, handcrafted wooden box. The lid was inlaid with a simple, elegant carving of a turtle. The tin turtle. My grandfather's work, I was sure of it. There was no lock, no key. I lifted the lid. Inside was not what I expected. There was no hidden treasure, no final secret. There was just a thick stack of blank, high-quality stationery and a single, beautiful fountain pen. Taped to the underside of the lid was the last note I would ever receive from my grandmother. It was short, only 2 sentences. "This is your story now, Elle. Write a good one." And just like that, the map she had laid out for me ended. The instructions were over. The rest of the pages were blank. It was up to me to fill them. It was the greatest gift she could have possibly given me. Not the money, not the secrets, but the permission to become my own author. The responsibility was terrifying, and it was liberating. I closed the box, a slow smile spreading across my face. I knew what I had to do. The night was far from over, but my vigil had served its purpose. I had my past, I had my future, and now I had my present. I spent the rest of the night by the fire, the laptop open on the crate beside me. I didn't look at the bank accounts again. Instead, I clicked on the folder labeled Building Plans. Inside were not architectural blueprints, but something far more valuable. They were my grandfather's journals. Scanned pages filled with his drawings, his calculations, his ideas. Plans for a rainwater collection system. Designs for a small-scale hydroelectric generator to be powered by the creek that ran through the property. Notes on passive solar heating and insulation techniques specifically for a Quonset hut. It was a complete manual for how to turn this metal shell into a self-sufficient, sustainable home. He hadn't just left behind a workshop. He had left a roadmap to independence. As the first hint of dawn began to lighten the sky, turning the cracks in the doors from black to gray, I made my first phone call. Not to Mr. Davies, not yet. I used the new hotspot to look up a number and dialed. A gruff voice answered on the second ring. "Miller's Feed and Seed." "Hello," I said, my voice clear and strong. "My name is Alara Vance. My grandmother was June Vance. I'd like to place an order for delivery. Some lumber, insulation, a few bags of concrete mix. And do you still carry wood-burning cook stoves?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "June's granddaughter?" the man said, his voice softening. "Lord, child, we were so sorry to hear. Of course. Whatever you need, just tell me where you want it sent." "The Quonset hut at the old Vance farm," I said. "Just leave it out front. I'll be there." "The Quonset?" he asked, confused. "Not the house?" "No," I said, looking around at my new home, bathed in the soft morning light filtering through the door. "Not the house." The delivery truck from Miller's arrived a few hours later, a big, rumbling flatbed that struggled up the gravel drive. The driver, a man about my father's age with kind, weathered eyes, helped me unload the supplies without a word. When we were done, he just tipped his hat. "Good luck to you, miss," he said, and I knew he meant it. The small-town grapevine was already at work. People knew. They were watching. As the truck drove away, Robert's car appeared, speeding up the driveway and screeching to a halt a few feet from the pile of lumber. He got out, his face a thundercloud. Diane was in the passenger seat, her face pinched with disapproval. "What is this?" he demanded, gesturing at the supplies. "What do you think you're doing?" I didn't answer him. I just picked up a pry bar and walked over to a stack of old wooden crates. I wedged the bar under the lid of the top one and heaved. The rusty nails groaned and the lid popped open. It was full of old canning jars. I started unloading them, setting them carefully on the ground. "I'm talking to you!" he shouted, taking a step toward me. I stopped and looked at him, my gaze level and cold. "I'm cleaning out my workshop," I said calmly. "You called it a liability full of junk. I'm dealing with it." His eyes narrowed, darting from my face to the pile of new lumber to the dark, silent doors of the hut. He was trying to solve a puzzle he didn't have all the pieces for. The uncertainty was eating him alive. "You can't stay here," he said, his voice lower now, trying a different tactic. "There's no water, no electricity. It's not habitable." "I'll manage," I said, turning back to the crates. "I'll get a court order," he threatened. "I'll have you declared a squatter." That's when I finally turned to face him fully. "You do that, Robert," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "You get your lawyer, and I'll get mine. My grandmother's lawyer, Arthur Davies. I'm sure he'd be very interested to see the paperwork I found. The paperwork about your gambling debts. The paperwork about the deal you forced on your sick mother. We can have a nice, long, public conversation about what's in the past. Or you can get in your car, drive down this driveway that you're so proud of, and leave me alone." The color drained from his face. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked at Diane, who was staring at me with a mixture of fear and horror. He had been exposed. The secret that gave him power over my grandmother was now a weapon aimed directly at him. He had no moves left. Without another word, he turned, got back in his car, and backed furiously down the driveway, spitting gravel. He didn't look back. I knew it wasn't the end of our interactions, but it was the end of his power over me. The war was over. The Cold War had just begun. I spent the next few months working. I called Mr. Davies, who, after hearing my story, released the $5,000 trust with a sound of deep satisfaction in his voice. I used it for immediate needs: food, more supplies, a portable toilet. The larger inheritance I left untouched for now, a silent, powerful backup. My days fell into a rhythm of hard, physical labor. I cleaned. I hauled out decades of scrap metal, sorting it into piles. The local scrap dealer, a friend of my grandfather's, came and hauled it away, pressing a surprising amount of cash into my hand. "Tom would have wanted you to have it," he said. I insulated the walls, covering the cold steel with warm panels of wood. I installed the cook stove. I ran plumbing lines for the rainwater collection system, following my grandfather's diagrams. I made mistakes. I hit my thumb with a hammer, cut boards too short, and spent one frustrating week trying to fix a leak in the roof. But with each mistake, I learned. With each small victory, a shelf that was level, a window that was sealed against the rain, the first hot meal I cooked on my own stove, I felt a growing sense of competence, of ownership. I had my grandfather's hands. I could build anything. My evenings were spent with a laptop, not just studying my grandfather's plans, but but studying for my GED. I was creating a home and a future, one textbook and one 2x4 at a time. The Quonset slowly transformed. It was no longer a tomb of memories, but a living, breathing space. My space. One afternoon, a car I didn't recognize pulled up. It was Mr. Davies. He got out, holding a thick envelope. "Thought I'd deliver this one in person," he said, a small smile on his face. "Your uncle has put the house on the market." I wasn't surprised. For Robert, the house was never a home. It was a commodity. He had his money. He had no more use for the land. "The developers who are buying it want the whole parcel," Mr. Davies continued. "Which means they want your half-acre too. They're prepared to make you a significant offer." He handed me the envelope. I didn't open it. I looked at my home, at the new windows I had installed, at the thin curl of smoke rising from my stovepipe, at the neat stacks of firewood I had chopped and piled myself. I thought about the $300,000 sitting in an account, untouched. I didn't need the developer's money. "No, thank you," I said, handing the envelope back to him. He looked at me, his eyebrows raised. "You didn't even look at the number." "The number doesn't matter," I said. "Some things aren't for sale." He broke into a wide grin. "Your grandmother said you would know what to do," he said, shaking his head in wonder. "She was right." My life now is quiet, and it is my own. The developers built their tract homes on the land around me, but my little half-acre, my tin turtle, remains. An island of history and self-sufficiency in a sea of suburban conformity. It's not an easy life, but it's a real one. I have a home that I built with my own hands, a legacy that I honored, and a future that I am writing myself on the blank pages my grandmother left for me. The pain of the past is still there. It's a scar that doesn't fade. But it's no longer the whole story. It's just the preface. It's the foundation upon which I've built everything else. My grandmother taught me that the greatest inheritance isn't a house or money. It's resilience. It's the knowledge that you can face the darkness and build your own light. It's understanding that home isn't a place you are given, but a place you create. This journey taught me that we are all the authors of our own lives, even when the first few chapters are written for us by others. You have the power to pick up the pen at any time and start a new chapter. Your story is not over. Thank you for being here, for listening. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to find strength in a difficult situation, or redefine what home means to you, I hope you'll subscribe and become part of this community. Share your own stories of resilience in the comments below, not for me, but for each other. Because every story shared is a light in the dark for someone else. You are not alone, and you are stronger than you know.